Hello, my name's Alison Cook and I'm the curate at Christ Church Stannington. Today's readings and talk are about the Syrophenician woman. We've got two readings, one from the Old Testament in Isaiah and one from the New Testament from Mark's Gospel. I'm going to read the Old Testament reading first. Isaiah chapter 35 and it's verses 4 to 7. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like a deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For waters shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. And then from the New Testament in Mark's Gospel, chapter 7, verses 24 to the end. From there he set out, that is, Jesus set out, and went to the region of Tyre. He entered a house, and he didn't want anyone to know he was there. But he could not escape notice. A woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, and of Syrophenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre, and went by the way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphaphrath," that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." Before I talk to you about these readings, let's pray. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Who do you want to be like? I know we're talking about church matters, so presumably the correct answer is Jesus. But thinking a little wider, I wonder, do you have a favourite Bible character that you maybe want to come back to time and again? I've always had a huge admiration for the Syrophenician woman. She's been my favourite since I was a child. Before I could get confused by looking too closely at the passage. Maybe it's because she features in the prayer of humble access. I've always liked that prayer too. It's the one that's said sometimes before we receive communion. It begins, "We do not presume to come to this your table, merciful Lord, trusting in our own righteousness, but in your manifold and great mercies. We are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under your table, but you are the same Lord, whose nature is always to have mercy." Or maybe you know it in the traditional form that says Jesus' property is always to have mercy. Now, property of something was something I learnt at school in chemistry when describing metals. I learnt that property defined what sort of metal they were. When we talk about Jesus' property, it is what is fundamental to who he is, what it is that defines him. And we see that Jesus is hardwired to always have mercy. The Syrophenician woman's story is difficult. However we choose to read it, we need to remember that Jesus' property is always to have mercy. But I think that prayer stood out to me simply because I recognised her story in it. And for a moment, when I received communion, I got to be like her. But first of all, what about Jesus in the story? How do we equate the way in which he speaks to her, calling her by a derogatory term, a dog? How do we equate that with the description in the prayer of humble access of always having mercy? In what way is Jesus being merciful to her? Let's go back a bit and just think about Jesus for a while. How did Jesus learn who he was? How do we learn anything? Think about it. Think, what do you think when you hold a newborn baby? For me, the same three things always go through my head. First of all, there's that initial shock. It happens every single time. I'd forgotten how small they are. Then there is amazement of a totally new individual lying so trustingly in your arms. And then I start to wonder. You look at the baby's face. Who does the baby look like? It doesn't matter how small they are. Those familiar family characteristics come through at a tiny age. A few days ago, Joe Rush kindly put a picture of Ezra up to celebrate his first birthday, and as I looked at it, I thought, oh, he's so like his dad. I haven't seen pictures of either John or Joe when they were young, so it's hard to judge, but to me, he does seem to have a lot of his dad's characteristics. Ezra is hardwired through his genes to look in some way like his parents. You can see the same in my children. Now, there is a saying, don't worry if your child doesn't listen to you. Worry that they are watching you all the time. Rob, our eldest, carries many of my side of the family's features, but his facial expressions and the way in which he moves is all Chris, all learned by constantly watching his dad during his formative years. It has been a beautiful thing to see develop because it tells me how much Chris means to Rob. Some of who we are is hardwired into us through our genes. Some is learnt by watching. And the same is true of Jesus. If we want to see what Jesus' characteristics are, we simply need to look at God and see what God's characteristics are. And they are there in our first Old Testament reading. The first reading from Isaiah in chapter 35 gives us an image of God. Like the Gospel reading, some of it is a difficult image and needs careful translation. The Good News says God is coming to punish your enemies. The NRSV that I used says God will come with vengeance, terrible recompense. When you look more closely into the language, what's actually meant is something more like redress or restitution, to put things back to how they ought to be. Or as I prayed at the beginning of this talk, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. There doesn't have to be the violence associated with some of the translations. The point is that God wants things to be restored to how they were supposed to be. Then Isaiah goes on to say, God will come and save you. The eyes of the blind will be opened, the ears of the deaf unstopped, the lame shall leap for joy, and even the physical world will be restored. There will be streams in the desert. This is such an image of hope for the world. And Jesus had been listening and following, because this is what he picks out in his inauguration of his mission. If we look back in Mark from our reading, you can see chapter 5 tells the story of Jesus healing Legion, the man full of demons in Gerasenes, a Gentile area. Legion was not a Jew, he was a Gentile. Now this is an unusual thing for Jesus to have been doing. When we get to chapter 6, Jesus is rejected from his hometown because of his teaching. If we want to get more details about what was actually happening there, we need to look in Luke chapter 4. There we find that Jesus was in the synagogue and reading from Isaiah chapter 61. Jesus reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free." You can see the similarities to the passage in Isaiah talking about God that we heard this earlier on, particularly the recovery of sight to the blind. But Jesus has edited out all talk of vengeance and Jewish superiority. Then, to make it clear to the people in Nazareth, he goes on to remind them that Elijah provided food for a Gentile widow, and Elisha healed Naaman from leprosy, another Gentile. Jesus is making a point. He's saying, I'm coming not for just the Jews, but also for the Gentiles. So for Jesus and for God, inclusion starts right here. Jesus saying that in a frontier town like Nazareth was going to cause trouble. The people were furious, and he was rejected by them. Now some would suggest that it's the Syrophenician woman who convinced Jesus to change his plans and include the Gentiles in his mission. But if you do that, you overlook the fact that Jesus has set out specifically to do this and has already started. Another suggestion is that Jesus is tired and doesn't want to be bothered. But look again at the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6. Jesus is about to take his disciples away for a well-earned rest, but he sees the crowd and has compassion. Jesus' property, his nature, is always to have mercy. He never gives up on people, and he is never rude just because he is tired. No, for Jesus to make a derogatory comment about a woman from a non-Jewish background, a Gentile, and for Mark to have included the account in his Gospel, his carefully worked out document that he wants people to read and see who Jesus is, that needs to be looked at very carefully. It must have been for a very good, wisely thought out reason. So what is going on? In chapters 4, 5 and 6, we have begun to see that Jesus' care is for all people, regardless of race or gender. Then in the beginning of chapter 7, Jesus gives specific teaching. He challenges the Pharisees over what makes a person clean or unclean. And he says breaking rules about hand washing, important as it maybe is for us particularly at the moment, but it was important for them too, doesn't make you unclean before God. It is what comes out of your heart, your attitudes, and your treatment of other people which makes you unclean. Now, Jesus isn't trying to convince the Pharisees. He knows they aren't going to listen. But he is giving his disciples a lesson. And then, to make the point crystal clear, he deliberately takes them to a Gentile area. Firstly to Tyre in modern-day Syria. We call the woman a Syrophenician woman. She is in fact what we would call nowadays a Syrian woman. Jesus slips into a house, but of course he is seen, and our woman comes to him. There are more details about their conversation in Matthew's version, but we get the drift quite clearly here. The woman is desperate. Her daughter is ill. In Matthew's Gospel, she begs Jesus to have mercy on her. She's feeling the pain of watching her child suffer, and it is unbearable. She is a Gentile woman, doubly barred from talking to Jesus. But she knows who he is, and she has faith in him. She has the courage to come to this Jewish man. I wonder, what did she expect would happen? Jews don't talk to Gentiles. Jewish men didn't talk to women. Do we think the disciples have been listening to the teaching of Jesus, which has just been given about inclusion, about what makes you unclean? Maybe in theory, but in practice they would have been repulsed by the audacity of this woman pushing herself forward. How on earth is Jesus going to get the point across to them that God so loved the world? Jesus has not come for the chosen few. He has come for all, for Jew and Greek, slave and free, male and female. Jesus looks at the woman. Does she have the courage to see through? Can she work with him and make this point utterly clear so the disciples will never forget? He takes a risk and challenges her. It's not right to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. There is no way round this statement. This is not cute little puppy dogs. This is not a beloved pet. This is an insult, a direct slur on her ethnicity. Will she turn and go away? No. She stays. The challenge is taken on. She believes Jesus doesn't mean it, and so do I. Her concern for her child is so great. Her belief in Jesus' healing power is so profound that instead of crumbling or leaving, she absorbs that insult and gives a reply laced in banter and even humour. Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. She knows what she is entitled to, and she is staying until she gets it. And she wins. Not just healing for her daughter, but she gains Jesus' utter approval. We see in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus applauds her for her faith. Not something you will find him doing often for his disciples. But this woman has won his admiration because she has trusted him completely and allowed him to let the disciples hear what their prejudice sounds like. Let them see what their superiority looks like in reality. She stands rock solid in the face of insults and potential rejection. And she comes through with mercy and inclusion, and she carries it off with dignity and humour. While Jesus has opened the ears of his disciples to their inner prejudices and opened the mouth of the woman to allow her to express her needs to the one who can save her. Then, in case the disciples really haven't got the message, Jesus continues to sidon to another Gentile area and heals a man of deafness and speech impediment, to do literally what he had just done figuratively. I love this magnificent, strong woman and delight to see Jesus' inclusive love rectifying a broken, divided world. But where does it leave us? Do you know where your unconscious bias is? Clearly not. We can't, because it is unconscious. Our biases aren't something to be ashamed of or afraid of. They are a product of our culture and upbringing. But are we willing to search ourselves and discover where we unwittingly make assumptions about people that degrade others or make ourselves superior? While I've been away, I gather there has been talk in the diocese about this, and there is material we could engage with to help us. Well, there's the Living in Love and Faith material again reaching out to groups of people who've often been neglected and made to feel unloved within the church as a whole. Or maybe we could make ourselves more aware of where the poor and rejected are within our parish. In particular, I'm thinking about the recent situation in Afghanistan and where we as a church can be seen to be responsive. We are very good as individuals in quietly supporting those in need. The response to the library, the food bank, those on the pastoral care team, and those of you who just quietly help their neighbours. And this is good. This is what we are called to do. But what Jesus did was to make his response visible. It is also good to act as a visible body, letting the community know this is the church's stance, so that we not only do the right thing, but we set the example for others. People still look to the church as an example, either as a lead or to criticise. And the criticism is usually the church's lack of action. With the Afghanistan situation, we have an immediate situation that we may be able to do something about. But there are other situations around us too. How are we going to be viewed as acting to those around us? If you remember one thing from this talk, then remember this. If you want to see God, you look to Jesus. If you want to see Jesus, you look to the church. My hope is that we become a church that seeks to restore those who have been rejected by society, by listening to them and meeting their needs where we can. By doing so, we shine a light on Jesus, whose love and inclusion shines equally a light on God, whose nature, whose property is always to have mercy.